We're back. We're live, and today we're going to spend some time with Fazle Chowdhury. He's a person of many skills. He's a management consultant, a lecturer in Washington, a contributing writer for a Portugal-based Expresso newspaper. It's the name of the newspaper is Expresso. I assume you're writing in English for that newspaper, not in Portuguese, because that's very challenging to write in Portuguese. Well, welcome to the show, Fazle.
Thank you. I couldn't have asked for a better introduction, but thank you, Jay.
So we're going to talk about Iran today, which I think is very interesting. He wrote two books about Iran: Promises of Betrayals, 2018, The History That Shaped the Iranian Shia Clerics, and Revived Failure, 2019, Iran's reality. I'm really interested in this, after the American withdrawal of the nuclear deal. So it's very important that we understand Iran, because I think, I'm sure you'll agree, that we're not getting the straight poop necessarily from the media about exactly what is going on with Iran. Of course, Trump was all over Iran and pulled that nuclear deal. And at the time, a number of the people I associate with wondered why. It seemed so abrupt, so violent, if you will, as against what Obama had done. So tell us what the reality was at the time, and this is a really hard question because it encompasses 20 years of history. What was the deal at the time Obama made that agreement? I mean, what was happening in Iran?
So to put this all in perspective, President Obama saw this as kind of a stepping stone to really assist Iran to come and integrate into a group of nations where they could do trade like a legitimate partner of the United States. It would be comparable to that of United States working with Mexico. It would be comparable with the United States working along the lines of European partners. But he wanted to do this in such a way where, I guess, in many sections, he wanted to avoid sectarian warfare that we see now in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, even to some context in Lebanon. So to put this all together, what does it really mean as far as the purposes of canceling the deal? Well, the canceling of the deal really centered on one thing, was to stop Iran from entering the financial market facilitated by the United States. But more importantly, to punish Iran for their negligence and really their way of propping up their proxies to make havoc for other regimes in Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, what have you.
Well, going back to a show we had some time ago, we had an Israeli fellow on, and his most interesting thing for me was about Turkey. What he said was that Turkey was the cornerstone of the Middle East. That it was, a nation that was or pretended to be Western. It understood various elements in the Middle East, culturally and geopolitically, and therefore it was very influential, a capstone, I think he called it. But I've come to feel that Iran has tremendous capability. It has an educated population. It has, aside from the problems it's had with the U.S. lately, it has a strong economy, or potentially a strong economy. It has a good geopolitical location, and it has been influential. The problem is that somewhere along the line, maybe it was after 1979, I don't know, and maybe it was based on the religious direction of Iran's governments. Iran has become a kind of Eastern capstone. Correct me if you disagree. An Eastern capstone of the Middle East. And it has taken on at least a reputation for terrorism, and has been engaged in various nefarious things around the Middle East, which are hard to understand. I mean, in terms of motivation and mission, why would it do that? Making itself a pariah, and I think it was Trump who called him a pariah. In a certain sense, they've earned that label, but I don't think we fully understand them. I don't think we understand them as the Eastern capstone of the Middle East. or is what motivates them. Can you help us understand what Iran is about, what it has been about since World War II?
So I will tell you the version that my granduncle used to tell me about Iran, which is it is the empire that has lasted for 2,500 years with
Okay.
multiple emperors. Uh, I know that's a loaded question, but that's where I'll begin. To your point about Turkey, yes, Iran has had very good relationship with Turkey, but it has also been part of, how do I put it? It had a very strong relationship with Turkey as it began. In my book, In Promises of Betrayals, which I covered about 500 years of Iranian history, the roots of really the birth of the Shia state actually began from rebels from the Ottoman Empire that basically formed what we see today as Iran. Now, yes, you are right. It has a very special place in the eastern part, but it also is very connected. It has a very strong relationship with Turkey. It has a very vibrant relationship with countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and not just connected to their Shia missionaries or Shia populations, but even the wider populations. Let me just tell you, just for an example, before India became India and before the British were in India, Farsi, the language that is spoken in Iran right now, that was the official language in India. It was considered kind of along the lines of what the Europeans would use as French as a diplomatic language. So Farsi was the language of diplomacy in Asia. Um, you talk about how Iran is connected, particularly nowadays, and of course, like the image that has changed from the time of the Shah, which of course he was a fantastic ally for the United States, and he certainly assisted the United States to find a very vibrant foreign policy post World War II via the Marshall Plan and so on, and then the Baghdad Pact, and the list can go on. But my real emphasis on how Iran's image has changed, of course, as you mentioned, after the Iranian Revolution of '79, has two central episodes. One, of course, was to really spread the revolution, and as how Ayatollah Khomeini wanted to spread the revolution even to the wider Middle East. Now, on that side, Iran was very successful in having that revolution succeed in Lebanon, but it hadn't succeeded in other parts of the Middle East. The image, of course, before the revolution was, in fact, very much of a cordial diplomatic relationship with all its neighbors. It had a very good relationship with even its most hawkish of neighbors, Iraq, of Saddam Hussein. But it was able to keep Iraq intact, regardless of how Saddam behaved, even recklessly at some points. But so to put it all together is that, yes, Iran pre '79 revolution was very interconnected, was a very vibrant uh, player in the Middle East, and even now in post-revolution is still a vibrant player because it is so connected.
Huh. Very interesting. But it's too bad. I mean, was it the revolution that created this reputation? Maybe it was a combination of things, but I'm wondering the revolution and this desire to extend its revolution to other neighboring countries created its terrorism and its negative image, at least among the West. Because somewhere along the way, may I use the expression, it went south. So somewhere along the way, it
Well, I
became
mean,
it became a renegade.
well, I mean, so there were certain circumstances. I mean, you have to take yourself back in 1979. I mean, what was happening in the neighborhood? Iraq had waged a war against Iran. You had a civil war in Lebanon. You had the Russians invading Afghanistan. Um, and you had a very difficult situation in what was happening in Saudi Arabia. Let's not forget that there was this incident where there was a takeover of the mosque in Medina, and it was a very difficult situation, but it had nothing to do with the Iranian Revolution, but it was actually more like a revolution from within that basically created kind of like a security surfaced prioritized state because of the revolution that was happening in Iran. And so to answer your question on that front is that yes, terrorism kind of laid the environment, but terrorism was also the environment Iran had to operate. I mean, when we look at Lebanon civil war, you see about the different proxies and the different groups that were fighting at the time. I mean, Iran had its proxy as well, and that was Hezbollah, but Hezbollah had another kind of a dimension back then. They were allied to other players. Their whole goal was to basically give rights to the Shia population of southern Beirut. It was no more of a political movement than the other groups that were in Lebanon. So to put it a little more specifically, that we see terrorism as kind of the surface, but when you dig down the surface, the environment was basically pretty plagued.
Yeah, well, we always have to examine it, and Lord knows the Middle East is complex. I mean, I'm interested, for example, when Iran decided, or its leadership decided, that in order to, what do you want to call it, survive and extend its influence in the modern world, it had to go into nuclear weapons. And what were the reasons for that? What was the circumstance around that?
So the nuclear weapon, actually, the engineering and the architecture of it did begin during the time of the Shah in the 1950s. And as a matter of fact, it had considerable assistance from the Eisenhower administration. But the length and even the timetable of developing it had slowed down considerably. It slowed down so much to the point that it became kind of a last priority from the Shah's white revolution that was happening at the time, which was really to bring in development and create a very strong middle class in Iran. Once that took the priority, then that was that. The nuclear question did not come about. The nuclear question only came about, I think, in post-Shah's time, post-revolution time, mainly because as Iran saw it as a way of developing peaceful nuclear technology and energy to basically support its own infrastructure. But that took a different length, certainly after what was happening in Syria in 2007. Keep in mind, the Israelis did bomb the presidential palace in Syria. That too took a different attitude for Iran when they suspected Iraq might have had biological weapons, but this was also kind of in the back burner until they too realized that maybe this might be an effort they too might venture in. So the mist of trying to develop all these kind of policies centered around nuclear weapons did not actually mature until the late 90s. And as a matter of fact, in 2003, the European top three, Britain, France, and Germany, sent their foreign ministers to negotiate a way to not venture into this kind of a lane, to say that this would be at the end be utterly reckless in some ways. But that's when it began. And as they began to really try to negotiate with the Europeans, Iran actually started developing and making it a policy seriously.
One thing you mentioned makes me feel that in the Eisenhower time and the Shah, we had a good relationship with them, and we saw them as, I guess, an oil producer. We saw them as somebody we could relate to. We could have good relations with. I think the Shah married an American woman, didn't he? Way back
No,
when?
he didn't. No, his first wife was an Egyptian princess. His second was Princess Soraya, who was very much European, but she was born in Iran. And third, of course, is still surviving wife, Princess Farah. So yes, all were two Iranian, one Egyptian, but no American. Sorry.
Okay, well, anyway, he was an American feature. I mean, he was connected with the U.S. government, good relations with him and so forth. And if you say that even back to the Eisenhower time, we considered them a candidate from foreign policy point of view, a candidate for nuclear weapons, our proxy, if you will, sort of like Pakistan. Our proxy is so to the point where we could allow them nuclear weapons and let them have technology and not stand in their way and all that. It sounds like we planted the seeds way back when, gave Iran the appetite, the understanding, the knowledge, the leverage to deal with nuclear, whether it's for peaceful or not peaceful purposes. But we familiarized them with this possibility even back in the 50s. Am I right?
Um, it's a hard way to look at it, but I mean, you have to understand what the situation was in the 1950s. We were in the middle of a Cold War. Iran was our ally. The Soviets are not so far away from the Iranian northern border. Then there was the situation of Iran had a very good relationship with Israel in the 1950s, and as a matter of fact, the Shah had considerable bilateral relations with Israel that made him particularly confident that he could go along the side of nations that were very pro-West. So the appetite, as you might say, there might have been there, but I don't think it was planted because I think in many senses it was very much centered around energy, not so much as a weapon. Because at the end of the day, the Shah had considerable reason to believe that the United States had his back. He had backing of other allies, particularly amongst even former Soviet allies. And so I think he was very confident. He was very confident in the 50s. He was very confident in the 60s. I don't think that kind of confidence kind of carried him through in the 70s as the decline began in Iran.
Well, talk about decline. It's all about, in your book, you refer to it as the student occupation of the American embassy back in 79, that part of the revolution, I guess. The revolution really led to a whole different world. I mean, for example, after the revolution, it was more a theocracy, and Iran was the relationship it had with Israel certainly declined, and by the time of Ahmadinejad,
Ahmadinejad, yeah.
Ahmadinejad back in the 15 years ago, maybe 20 years
in 2006, yeah.
He was, out there calling for the destruction of Israel, and that was not a happy time. The relationship with Israel had completely disintegrated, and each one was the enemy of the other. And I'm sure that Israel was very concerned that Iran had a presence and was, operating, if you will, in Lebanon, so close to its border. How big a role did that play in American foreign policy to find that those two had fallen out so completely?
Well, I mean, it does give a lot of caution, and there's a lot of caution because Israel is such a close ally. And it's the only democratic state in the Middle East that we identify as our true ally. And so the security of Israel is very integral to any kind of administration that comes to Washington. And so when you have a state like Iran who makes, or Ahmadinejad who makes that kind of threats, administrations are concerned. They're concerned because what does that really mean? Because we didn't see these kind of threats before. And we knew there was tension, we knew there was friction, but we did not know what this would mean as a conflict. We now know, particularly what it has become. Iran is very active in Syria, and that in fact has sucked in Lebanon into it, and you do see a lot of problems in the Golan Heights border between Syria and Israel. And so, to answer your question, I think that's what it has turned and became. I don't think it was the official policy of Iran, particularly during Ahmadinejad's time, to make this all-out kind of a proxy war. The proxy war basically became as the environment led itself in Syria.
Mm. Wow, this is so interesting, because you can't help but think that if Iran had been a good neighbor, if Iran had not had these, um, guerrilla type, terrorist type operations in its neighboring countries, and if it maintained, a sort of cornerstone approach, as to some extent Turkey has maintained, the Middle East would be a completely different place. It would be a garden. It would be an economic powerhouse. People would be focused on trade and culture and all the right things instead of the destruction that's going on in how many countries. In Syria, there was a piece on 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago that talked about Bashar Assad's campaign to terrorize and torture young people, young children, in the warring areas of Syria. Really a destroyed state, a failed state. And then you have Yemen, another failed state. So much of the Middle East is a failed state. I mean, and to have what's his name, MBS, guilty of what he did to Khashoggi, that doesn't speak well for Saudi. So what we have here is it's not a garden at all. It's contentious, it's violent, and Iran is not playing. Am I right about this? Iran has not been playing a positive role. It could. It has the resources. It has the education. It has the culture. It has the connections, as you said, but it hasn't been playing a positive role. Am I right?
So it's kind of on two fronts. So particularly the issue of Iran playing a central role with its neighbors as a force of good. In some ways, it has. I say that because, particularly when the United States invaded Afghanistan shortly after 9/11, one of the key partners that allowed certain kind of groups to fall in line with the American uh, invasion and even American cooperation was, in fact, the Iranians. They did get their allies on board with the United States to make the process easier in Afghanistan, and they continue to do so. In Iraq, shortly after the invasion, the seminaries, the Shia seminaries in the south that basically opened up to the Shia pilgrims, actually operated in a way to give sanctuaries to the battles that were happening, particularly around the Baghdad suburbs. So when you look at those kind of episodes, you can certainly say, yes, it wasn't perfect, but there was some mechanism of peace that was in place.
Mm.
Now, the violent parts, I can't speak too much to that because I try to take a very much more of a positive, pro-business, pro-diplomatic role here, and that has basically matured shortly after the withdrawal of the Jcpoa. I mean, I kept on saying in my book that the purpose of the Jcpoa was two reasons. One was to stop sectarian violence,
And that's the agreement that Obama negotiated with Iran during
that's right.
his term.
Yeah, that's right. It was to stop this sectarian violence, and the other was to develop a clear path to start a financial relationship with Iran that will lend itself to get rid of its bad practices. Once the withdrawal happened in 2018, the bad actors or the bad habits that you speak of, they basically came up to the surface. Dual citizenships, Iranians who have dual citizenships, they're constantly harassed upon arrival or even leaving. Then there is the issue of
You mean in Iran or the U.S. or both?
Iran, UK, Iran, US. There are a number of families that have been affected on that front. Then there's the issue of human rights. For a while, it looked like the Jcpoa would open up this angle where human rights organizations would be able to begin a process, and that has been stalled. And then there was the issue of the financial markets that were really waiting to mature and get the signals to see that, okay, when can we understand that we can really go in full force to open up the Iranian market? Now, much of this, as I say, yes, this was a way how the bad actors kind of found license, but the environment didn't lend itself for the good actors to play at the same time. I mean,
Yeah.
Iran is it's a controlled economy. The Shia theocracy has a very solid control over its own domestic market, and even how it conducts trade between the big players of Russia, China, India, Korea, Japan, you name it. So it's a tricky environment to say that, okay, did they really go bad or did they really go rogue? You know, even in rogue regimes, sometimes the peacemakers are kept silent. And I think that's what happened, is that when you have an agreement that you thought had so much hope, all of a sudden it's taken away. It's really the good actors in Iran, particularly the moderate clerics, that suffered and will suffer, particularly in the forthcoming election, which I believe is coming up in June. And so, which is why I think the time to have President Biden to really act on this reviving the Jcpoa really needs to speed up.
Some points that come to mind is this. It seemed to me at the time Obama negotiated that deal with Iran that it was pretty positive, and he got a number of European nations to come along, and the world as it saw Iran had enough confidence in Iran to abide by it. I think the one thing that I had some concern with later after was that there was no provision in that agreement to limit terrorist activities, operations by Iran in the rest of the Middle East, which is, I think Obama missed that, or he somehow could not achieve that as a term in the agreement. It would have been better.
It certainly would have been, but it's also one of those things where you knew that if you did bring that up, it would be very difficult not only to enforce it, but get the Iranians on the table to begin with.
Yeah.
So, I think the administration back then was looking for a way to really take this step by step and focus on really having a direct line to the key actors in Iran. And in this case, it was, of course, the Ayatollah Khamenei, sorry.
Well, I think, isn't it fair to say that Obama knew it was not a perfect deal, but he was optimistic, and he felt that if you offered Iran, a civilized way to deal with this issue and stop being a pariah and having the opportunity to develop that economic strength that it could and should develop, that they would come around, not only within the confines of that deal, but generally as a good neighbor, as a good citizen of the world. So my question to you is, was that going to happen? Was it happening? Was Iran becoming a better citizen in the global community because of that deal? Prior to Trump's pulling the rug out from under it?
I think the evidences were there, and the evidence was particularly amongst the Europeans, because the Europeans were very, very confident that this was going to work and it was going to work well. The big three Europeans, France, Germany, UK, they were certainly on board. And the Russians and Chinese, they don't look eye to eye most of the time with the United States, but they were on board too, and quite early on. But what was interesting in this was that while there was some level of distrust, the IAEA and the United Nations really came.
The IAEA is the
International Atomic
Energy. Yeah.
Yeah. They really came in and really kind of created that layer of confidence to say that if we do our jobs and if Iran plays true to its commitment, then I think this has hope. This has a huge potential. And at least in the initial stages, it looked formidable. I mean, the kind of language that you see, the the kind of language that you see often, particularly around 2015, 2016, particularly in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, it was very, very positive. Never have you ever seen that kind of positivity, particularly since I think the Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestinians. So I think like this was like a better kind of scenario, and I, for one, had a lot of hope. But it's a shame how it has become now.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. I mean, I also had hope. I knew that it wasn't perfect. I knew that it was, that maybe it would fall apart. You don't know. There was a period of time where in which the Iranians could have sort of turned around and said, "We're going to do nuclear weapons, and just so leave us alone." But that didn't happen, at least not visibly. And then we have Trump, and he arrives and decides that they're on his enemies list, and he's going to do these brutal moves on foreign policy. Brutal. Everything he did was brutal, and certainly that was brutal what he did. He pulled the rug out. He made him an enemy. He called them names and so forth, and it was predictable, even to somebody who's not initiated in foreign policy and global politics, that they would react badly because they had come to the table. They had cut a deal. They were at least at some level conforming with the terms of the deal. And he just pulls the whole thing out and goes back to square one. And square one wasn't so good. So I would imagine the people in Iran on all sides of the political spectrum would have been really ticked off. Am I right?
Um, I think it was anticipated. I think the first hints of when you see the Iranians really stop actually showing signs of not commitment is really in the presidential primaries. So when you see the presidential primaries and you see what is happening
This is 2016.
in 2016, yeah. You see in the summer of 2016 really Iran taking kind of like not keeping the attention on the JCPOA, but more strategic attention going towards what is happening in Syria, what is happening in Lebanon, what is happening in Iraq, what is happening in Yemen. And that kind of gave me a hint to say that, wait a minute, I think the priority now has shifted. And the priority has shifted because the leadership in Iran believes that with a Trump presidency, the JCPOA won't survive. And even if it does survive, it will survive purely because of the Europeans. But even then, when I read some of the articles coming in from Tehran, it seemed that the Iranians were more interested in an alliance with the United States, specifically in the JCPOA, than be with its secondary partners, who are the Europeans.
I don't think we realize how mean Trump was with the Europeans. I mean, he was laying these sanctions against them for trading with Iran. I mean, multi-billion-dollar sanctions against them. He was, if you are friends with my enemy, then you are my enemy, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the directive was that, if any European firm was found to have done any business with Iran, they will face backlash. And they will face a backlash not just in sanctions, but also as how American companies do business with them. Now, what's interesting about this is that when the JCPOA was committed and signed, it was the Israeli Defense Ministry that said that Israeli generals, particularly retired Israeli generals, were very much for this deal because that gave them assurance that at least, as how you say, terrorism is in the region will be reduced, and we did see a lot of that. But of course, the time for it to mature just did not happen.
Yeah, right. It didn't have the chance to breathe. So, question, I guess we're agreed, are we not, that the Trump's maneuver, pulling out of that deal, was really bad. It was bad for everybody involved. It was a classical gaffe in terms of foreign policy and global relations. That there was nothing redeeming about it, no benefit whatsoever. and it essentially has backfired since then. Am I right?
Yeah, the pros are very, very much. I mean, you cannot even identify the pros. The negatives are just too big and heavy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, where are we right now? I mean, so we had this very surgical attack on I guess it was an Iranian base of some kind in Syria, near the Iranian border, I suppose. We had that, and we've had a bunch of, even in the Biden time, and the last thing I heard was that Iran wasn't going to negotiate with Biden. Biden wants to negotiate. He's put out olive branches even since the beginning of his short time in the job. But Iran is saying no. That's very troubling to me because they must know that he's in good faith and he's a good negotiating partner, a positive individual.
Yeah, I
So,
mean,
yeah,
what we forget is that the team Biden has is the team that actually was in the front line in carving out the Jcpoa deal. And so he has probably the most fantastic of experts around him to make this happen. But the problem is the fact that in Iran's terms, they believe that since the United States exited from the deal, they're the ones who should come back first. But the United States, particularly Biden, believes, and his team believes, that the bad behavior, particularly that Iran has accumulated in the last 4 years, that needs to be addressed first before any steps take on. So it's really a child's play between who goes first, which doesn't help. As I said to you earlier on this interview, like Iranian elections are coming up in June, and I have a very good feeling that the candidate that's gonna come in the presidential election in June is going to be pretty anti-JCPOA. And it's really going to be difficult for the Biden administration if that happens. So they do have to act now and pretty quickly.
yeah, and make all the olive branches necessary. Seems to me that unless they do that, and Iran remains angry and isolated and stressed over this, certainly as it is now. They will take all the steps they care to take to develop nuclear weapons. B, they'll be stressing our relationships with the European countries involved, which Trump did achieve that. And C, seems to me that we're further away from peace in the Middle East, and there'll be more aggravations, sometimes initiated by Iran, but the place is unstable now. It'll be more unstable going forward unless we get back to some kind of peace agreement with Iran.
I think there is an opportunity, but the window is shrinking and shrinking quite fast. So I think like the piece that you're talking about can and still happen. I'm optimistic about it because I think in the grand scale of things, other allies want this to happen as well. And when I say other allies, I mean allies like Jordan, allies like Egypt, all who were previously, I think, were not exactly for this agreement, but I suspect they are now because it affects their neighborhood. It affects their neighborhood in a way where they too do not want to be part of this kind of a fallout.
Yeah.
Because all regimes in the Middle East are now, particularly after in this pandemic, it is dealing with significant challenges. You don't want another war to make this even worse.
We have a few minutes left, and I want to just sneak one more question in about this, and that is, so Biden did release that intelligence report on Khashoggi and his death and MBS, and that doesn't make the Saudis look too good. And he's trying to stop the Saudis' use of American weapons in Yemen, which I would fully agree with children. But there's a secondary effect, isn't there? To the extent there's a deterioration between the U.S. relations and Saudi, that has an effect on on Iran because of Saudi's special relationship with Iran. Am I right? Is there a connection there?
Oh, well, I mean, Saudi Arabia does not have a special relationship with Iran right now. They did at one time, but that was before the revolution. Um, what is happening between the United States and Saudi Arabia, I think, it's not that much of a change if you really think about it. I mean, this is kind of like how one would say, I mean, if the United States was really serious, there would be additional kind of measures in addition to what is happening against MBS. Iran can probably look at it as like, it's okay, we probably got ourselves 15 seconds to take a deep breath, but that's about it. I don't think the reality for Iran is changing. They are still they have a very difficult situation right now domestically. Inflation is high. Oil is operating in world market prices, and they are still under sanctions. They don't want to negotiate about ballistic missiles, and that is one of the top priorities that needs to be discussed before the United States goes back into the deal. So what is happening with MBS, when you think about it, is really not much of a difference because Iran still has a large bag of piles of things to resolve compared to what they're seeing with the United States and Saudi relationship.
Yeah. Well, there's more. We could talk about this for a long time. I took a look at your presence on the web, and I found that you wrote several books, and I'd just like to go through them if I can find them here. You had like 5 books you wrote, Fazle, and I wanted to go through them. It's not only the 2 books on Iran, Promises of Betrayals, and then the most recent one, which came out a year ago.
About Revived Failure, that's the one that I mentioned. Yeah.
But you have 3 or 4 other books, and so you've really made this a specialty. And I think it's valuable in the sense, I mean, not only for you, but for everyone to know more about the region, to know, and you do write, you write well, and you write in detail about, in the book that I looked at, that is the one we're talking about today, Revived Failure, to educate people about, all the various considerations. I think you said in your description that it was somewhat controversial, and I can just understand that because it's controversial in this country in general. This country is a picture of controversy about foreign policy and everything else these days. But I think we have got to understand what's going on in Iran because, like it or not, Iran is an important player in the Middle East. And so myself, I would urge people to look at your book and look at the other books that you've written about the area.
Actually, just to give you a little insight, Jay, my other 3 books that are not related to Iran are novels, but they have similar kind of themes associated to them. And so, I usually got a backlash amongst my students saying that, some of your books might be too policy centric, and I took that into account and I wrote these novels. And some of them who have read it and some of them who reviewed it came back to me and said they actually liked the novel better. But what they don't understand is that the policy had been converted into a story. So
sure, easier to digest that way. So it's Never Among Equals is one.
Yeah, it's soon to come out in April. Yes.
Okay. Is that ostensibly a novel or is that nonfiction?
It is a novel.
Okay. And another novel, With Dark Understandings. And this is all about the Middle East and the players in the Middle East. Am I right?
No, not some of them are rooted into historical fiction. Some of them, because I studied history as an undergrad, and I've kind of like taken the opportunity during the pandemic to like say, okay, what is it that I can carve out and write something about that makes it a little interesting to those who find a lot of the policy boring. So I've kind of used those kind of angles, and hopefully and thank goodness it's been received a little better than my books on Iran.
Okay, then the other one, the last one I noticed of the 5 is The Other Side of Eden, also a novel. Yeah, you've got a whole array of books here, and they're all on Amazon, I take it.
That's right. Yeah.
And I asked you at the outset if you would just give us a sample of your writing style. Revived failure would be a good place to start. Can you read a paragraph or a few sentences just so we can feel it?
Yeah, sure. This is on page 49. The cost of imports has shot up because of the real's currency weakness. As a result, businesses and community groups that once supported the Iranian president are losing confidence in his leadership. But before the signing of the Jcpoa, Iran was under a deep recession. After signing the nuclear deal, the International Monetary Fund reported that the real GDP of Iran grew by 12.5% in the very first year. After growth fell by 4%, Iranian hardliners, conservative Shia clerics demanded that the United States can never be trusted. China, the Europeans, and Russians moved in to gain a better foothold in the void.
Yeah, well, that does have the sound of an MBA professor, doesn't it?
Well, I try to advise my clients as well as my other peers that, even there are romantics amongst those who are perceived to be boring.
I'm very valuable. I did look at the most recent one, and I really enjoyed looking at it. Thank you so much, Fazle. Fazle Chowdhury, a teacher, a lecturer, an historian, if you will, and certainly a global political scientist. Thank you so much. Aloha.
Jay, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.